I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Chopper to my friends, and this is Chopper's Politics. Now, I promise you, this isn't the start of a bad joke, listeners, but what unites Boris Johnson, Meghan Markle, and the woke brigade? That's right, they've all come under fire from our guest today, Mr. Piers Morgan, the host of Good Morning Britain on ITV, the former CNN anchor, and former editor of the Daily Mirror, has a new book out called Wake Up, Why the World Has Gone Nuts. It's subtitled on its title page, Our Eyes Have Been Opened, We Must Never Close Them Again. The book takes the form of a diary from the first half of 2020, when the world did go a bit, well, rather nuts. It takes a swipe at the woke culture wars, illiberal liberals, along with salad emojis and vegan sausage rolls. Piers Morgan, former newspaper editor, breakfast TV anchor, turned anti-woke warrior, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Now, in my hand, I've got a book called Wake Up by Piers Morgan. Now, you've been awake all morning, of course, presenting GMB on ITV, but why do we need this book and why do you have to write it?
Well, I was asked to write it by HarperCollins last November, so about a year ago, because they noticed that on Good Morning Britain, I'd been railing against what I saw as the creeping attack on freedom of speech, driven in the main by my fellow liberals, because I consider myself to be more liberal than not. And there was a kind of this woke brigade, the very illiberal, liberal, slightly fascist element of my liberal friends who just want to have the right to dictate to everybody else how they should lead their lives, how they should speak, what they should find funny, what they should enjoy watching, how they should dress, what they should eat, what they should drink. You know, every aspect of our lives is suddenly being controlled by a small group of very noisy people on social media who threatened you with cancellation if you didn't do exactly what they told you to do. So I was already writing it, and then the pandemic struck, and I've always been a diarist. And I said to the publishers, I think we should do this in real time, because then we can have the historic importance of the pandemic in real time. But we can also show how far from what I hoped would happen, which is giving people the perspective to get rid of this woke nonsense, as the year went on, it actually exacerbated it. So I think in the end, we ended up with a diary which serves two purposes. One, I think it's got a historical record of this extraordinary year so far, but also secondary to the threat of the pandemic, I do think this illiberal threat to freedom of speech is hugely important.
You say in the book that it came from a burning desire to stop my fellow liberals behaving like arseholes.
Well, that was Stephen Fry's line, actually.
Oh, was it? Forgive me.
I reported Stephen Fry. He said that the way to attack arseholes on the right is not for the arseholes on the left to behave like arseholes. And he had a really good point, is that, you know, in the end, the woke brigade have ended up behaving exactly like the people they profess to hate.
Do you agree it comes from a kind place? These are people who think they're kind and they're trying to look out for everybody else.
Well, that was the original intention of being woke. And in fact, the genesis of it is very interesting. You know, historically, being woke meant you were just alert and awake to social and racial injustice. I could happily sign up to such a movement. But what's happened in the last few years, fueled in part by the Me Too and Time's Up movements, which obviously led to the cancellation of lots of bad men, it then got used as a license to effectively cancel anyone and everything that this, as I say, rather small group of people have decided they don't like. And it's gone way beyond social and racial injustice, and it's become a form of illiberal tyranny. I mean, I don't get any abuse when I'm out and about in the streets. In fact, the complete opposite, which might amuse and surprise some of your listeners, but I just don't. I do get loads of it on Twitter, but it's all the keyboard warriors in their dungeons firing off their four pennies worth. I don't really mind. I think Twitter's this kind of mad democracy in a way. Everyone's entitled to their view, and if they want to abuse me, they can. I can always block them. I don't have to put up with it. But what it shows me is there's a real visceral toxicity on Twitter in particular, and it's driven by a lot of self-righteousness, where whether it's Brexit or Donald Trump or even the pandemic now and coronavirus or vaccines or masks, everyone has to get into their tribe, and then they refuse to be deviated from their tribe regardless of what facts then emerge. And that's the real danger for democracy, because if you're not prepared to change your mind based on factual or scientific evidence, then what's going to happen to democracy?
Isn't the problem basically Twitter?
Well,
if you get off Twitter...
Well, I love Twitter.
Yeah, but if you leave Twitter, the problem stops.
Well, I think the thing is you can leave Twitter, yeah, but then you're going to remove yourself from the most extraordinary news service that there's ever been. I ran a daily newspaper, the Daily Mirror, for nearly 10 years, and I thought we had great access to news as it happened, but we were not even the same league as Twitter. And every journalist I know loves Twitter, is addicted to Twitter, because actually it's the number one news source now for everybody. If things happen, we hear about it usually first on Twitter. So I think it has a lot of valuable potential, Twitter. What's the problem with it, and Facebook's having the same problem, is that it doesn't have much of a bar to root out the really vile conspiracy theory, nasty, vile, abusive type of people who should not be given a platform under normal circumstances, but find one through social media and then find a weird support building, and then it becomes dangerous.
Yeah. Is it about virtue signalling, these woke warriors, do you think?
Yeah, a lot of it is virtue signalling. A lot of it is a lot of people I know who are high profile. I know them well, and what they say on Twitter bears little relation to what they say to me over dinner. And that's where I have a problem with what I call the virtue signalling wokies, because they say stuff purely because they want to be liked, even if it's not what they actually believe. If you genuinely have a principled view about something, and all my opinions, whether people like them or not, they're genuinely held opinions. I never say stuff because I want to be popular. If I wanted to be popular, I would operate in a very different way. I'd rather be completely honest about my opinions, even if I know they're going to be inflammatory to people. But what I can't abide are people who spew all this holier-than-thou nonsense on Twitter, and then when I meet them, they say the complete opposite, and in fact, make my opinions look like a tea party. That really is the essence of virtue signalling, where it's not what you really believe, you just latch onto a bandwagon to make yourself look good.
It all started with the vegans, as far as I can make out. The book describes how you couldn't believe the fact that the egg was removed from the salad emoji on mobile phones because that might offend vegans.
Well, it's a good illustration to me of the double standards, because Google, one of the biggest multinational companies, obviously in the tech world ever, decided one day they were going to joyfully announce they were removing the egg from their salad emoji. Now, it might seem a very tiny, insignificant point, but think about the principle here. They did that because a few radical vegans screamed at them that it was offensive to have an egg in the salad emoji. But what about the 98% of us that love eggs? Where is our right to have the egg remain in Google salad emoji? And it seems to me, again, this tiny group, who I think do most vegans a disservice, but they get what they want, and we are not allowed to have our rights to like and eat and admire eggs tolerated at all.
But Piers Morgan, you say about our rights, aren't you also virtue signaling back at them on behalf of your gang?
Well, no, what I'm saying is a salad conventionally would contain an egg, and no one should mind about that. It shouldn't be a matter for great contention or dissent. My point is about where is equality, where is fairness? I'm not demanding the egg be in the salad emoji. I was quite happy with the salad emoji as it was. But the moment a radical vegan has it removed because an egg is offensive to them, I say, well, what about our right to like an egg? You don't see meat eaters running into vegan restaurants and screaming abuse at them and playing them sounds, for example, of bees to make almonds and almond milk and avocados. How do they do that? They use billions of bees, which they use to pollinate. In that process, millions of bees get killed, murdered, slaughtered. Do you ever hear a vegan ever talk about the slaughter of the bees? Do I, as a meat eater, run into vegan restaurants screaming, what about the bees, and playing the sound of bees being annihilated? No, I don't. But they want the right to run, as a quote in the book, down in Brighton, running into a steakhouse and playing music of cows being slaughtered. Well, there's hypocrisy there. What about the little guys? What about the bees? Almond munchers.
Is it then hypocrisy? The thing we search for as journalists throughout our career, looking for hypocrisy, is that what is at the heart of your woke concerns?
Yes. A lot of it is double standards and hypocrisy. A lot of it is also driven by a self-righteous sense of I'm not just entitled to my opinion, but my opinion is the only opinion that you're allowed to have. And if you don't share my opinion about everything, I'm going to really pile on you on social media. And unfortunately, companies around the world have bowed to this mob for too long and have acquiesced to it and given them what they want, which is employees' heads on platters. And we see the cancel culture. You know, if when it's thrown at me, I'm not going to get cancelled. People can try. They have tried. I've had petitions to have me deported from the US over my attack on gun culture. I've had a petition to have me sacked by ITV for saying that the BBC suggesting there are 100 plus genders is ridiculous. But it hasn't worked because I have my own platform and can fight back. Where it's really insidious is over people. For example, there was an author I hadn't heard of, a fairly anonymous author, who got cancelled by her publisher for tweeting support for J.K. Rowling when she made her comments about transgenderism, which J.K. Rowling's perfectly entitled to raise in the context of wanting to protect women's rights. It's a debate that should be had. But because this author had dared to suggest that she might agree with J.K. Rowling, she got cancelled by her publisher. And it's that is the real problem here, where companies bow to the pressure from a woke mob that doesn't allow alternate opinion.
Have you lost friends over this, the book or your views? I mean, the way you stridently put them out there on GMB and Twitter.
No, I haven't lost friends. What I've done, I've come off friend WhatsApp groups, different types of groups I was on, because I have enough arguments at work. I don't want to be in a WhatsApp group with my village mates or, sporting friends, whatever, where we then have further raging arguments about Brexit or Trump or coronavirus. I'm not interested. I'm exhausted by the time I get there. I want to hear about how their kids are, how their golf game's going. So I think that, unfortunately, it has dripped down. I'm sure everyone who's on a WhatsApp group knows what I'm talking about. There comes a point when it stops being much fun and becomes just a real locking of horns, like stags in a park. And I just don't want that in my life outside of work. I rant in columns, I rant on Twitter, I rant on Good Morning Britain. I'm ranted out by the time I get to my friends' WhatsApp groups. So I've come off those and actually have a great relationship with all those people now because I'm not constantly arguing with them too.
Well, I've got to ask, are you really anti-woke or just like getting into fights, Piers Morgan?
Well, I love getting into fights, don't get me wrong. I love having arguments, but I would always respect somebody's right to have a different view to me. And I would never want somebody cancelled, except in extreme circumstances where their behaviour is so, for example, overtly racist. David Starkey, the historian, would be an example where after several offences, that he basically did get cancelled, but he got cancelled by the right and the left. Everybody agreed that what he said was indefensible. And I think that's a sensible way to cancel people who are just beyond the pale and have misused their platform.
On the case of Starkey, he said that point about slavery not being a genocide because there were, his quote, so many damn blacks, close quotes.
Yeah, I just think what he said was indefensible. If you were a black person listening to that, you must have been utterly horrified. And the fact that he's an eminent historian, given a huge platform to spout this kind of nonsense, I think is unacceptable. So it's not like there's no opportunity to effectively cancel people. I'm not saying that, but where the cancel culture extends to anyone expressing any kind of opinion that the woke brigade don't like, then it becomes dangerous. It's not about stopping fascists being fascists or racists being racist. It's about the run-of-the-mill stuff, which every day you see people saying, I just lost my job because I dared to say that James Bond shouldn't be a woman.
We're talking on the morning after Greg Clark quit as FA chairman. He used the term coloured people, not people of colour. He talked about Asian people working on IT, not being footballers. Some people might say, well, that shows you can't say anything. I mean, a series of misspeaks there. Is that unfair or fair?
I think he didn't intend to be offensive, but he was offensive. He was supposedly presiding over the Football Association. Football is one of the most diverse sports in the world. Most of the best young players in the Premier League are now black. What do you think they're going to hear when the chairman of the FA doesn't realise that using the phrase coloured about black players is offensive, that it takes them back to apartheid South Africa? Language matters when we talk about these things, particularly if you are presiding over a game like football played by so many black players. I thought what he said about being gay was a life choice. Unbelievably offensive, particularly when we know how sensitive that issue is for gay footballers who've already felt too cowed to be able to come out for fear of the ridicule and abuse they may receive. Now, I don't think he was being deliberately offensive. I think he probably was baffled by the reaction. But he even said that, girls don't like the football being kicked at them. What message does that send?
Yeah.
As the chairman of the FA to the women's game, which has been growing exponentially and really successfully, apparently girls are too scared of a football to be in goal. It's utter nonsense. So I just thought he sounded to me like a completely out-of-date elderly dinosaur who just hadn't gone with the program. And the program is about fairness, equality, and diversity. It shouldn't be difficult to find a boss of the FA or any company right now who understands that the kind of stuff he was saying is simply unacceptable.
If language matters, couldn't the same be said of, say, the trans community who get offended by J.K. Rowling's comments you mentioned earlier? Isn't it the same thing?
Well, the trans debate to me is an interesting one because I'm completely supportive of trans rights, right to the point where they damage or impinge on women's rights. And by women, I use the category of women born to female biological bodies. And you can see with sport, for example, the massive unfairness that is being created by having transgender athletes who were born to male biological bodies being allowed to compete against women born to female biological bodies. It creates an unfairness, a new inequality. That should be a debate we should all be able to have without everybody losing their mind. But because the trans lobby driven on social media can be very aggressive and is very fond of the cancel culture, it means that if someone like J.K. Rowling dares to air, she wrote a very long blog, thousands of words about this, which I thought she made some very good points. I didn't agree with all of it, but I thought she made some good points. You've got to be able to debate this without everybody losing their mind.
In the book, you cover the contentious topic of blackface, talking about how Justin Trudeau was photographed and filmed being blacked up. And we talked about Greg Clark and David Starkey losing their jobs, but he never lost his job, did he? Is it because you get one chance to make a mistake and you get forgiven? Is that the point? But repeated mistakes mean you're out?
Well, I wish he had made one mistake, but Justin Trudeau made repeated errors. In fact, throughout his early adult life, even when he was, I think, 30 and a teacher, he was blacking up his face. Did it 3 times, it turned out. So this was the number one woke world leader, a man who wants to end the word mankind because it's sexist and wants to call it people kind, ultimate wokery. And yet there he was, repeatedly blackfacing his way through his 20s and early 30s. When it came to him, though, he was able to go, oops, sorry. And the woke brigade immediately forgave him because it was one of their own. Now, Megyn Kelly, who is a top Fox News and then NBC TV news superstar, went to NBC and got hounded out of her job because she didn't blackface herself. She just said it used to be acceptable on Halloween to blackface. That's completely true. It never used to be an issue. It is now, and I would argue rightly, it stopped being a practice on Halloween. She didn't say she wanted it back. She just said it used to be the case, it wasn't offensive. Why is that? She got hounded out of her job despite making a tearful apology on air. And the only reason is because she basically is a conservative and she wasn't a wokey like Justin Trudeau. And that, again, comes back to the central theme of the book of this appalling double standard that the woke crowd give to these issues. If they were consistent, that's one thing, but they're not.
You think we should let people wear fancy dress? There's been pictures of you on the internet wearing a Nazi uniform at a party back in the 80s. Should we not be more forgiving of historic misdemeanors in a different time, different context?
Well, I think costumes, this kind of cultural appropriation stuff that goes on all the time, to me, is completely out of control. I think you could admire other cultures and celebrate them without it being offensive. And have we really lost the right to do that? My overview would be most people know the limits. Most people understand common sense. Most people know when people are setting out to be offensive and when they're not. And I think that's the line that you have to draw with these things. I think the old days of heroes and villain parties where you could wear what you like, nowadays there's always going to be somebody with a camera who's going to shout, I'm outraged, I'm deeply offended, even if obviously you're celebrating something unpleasant deliberately because it's supposed to be a villain. And we all used to watch Dad's Army and Low and stuff like that. So I think that, again, it comes back to common sense.
Hello, I'm Katie Morley and I'm the Telegraph's consumer champion. It's a big job title, but what it really means is I spend my days helping readers who are being ripped off. I've heard from victims of wicked scams, insurance customers who can't get payouts, and customers who've been treated badly by retailers. I've seen it all. And I've managed to win back over £2 million for our readers in a year. But I couldn't have done it without our subscribers. And that's where you come in. If you subscribe to The Telegraph, you're helping fund public service journalism like this, as well as great podcasts like Choppers. So, to support what we're doing and to get unlimited access to a huge range of world-class journalism, head to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where we have a special listener offer. You can get 30 days free access to The Telegraph online, and after that, it's just £2 a week. That's telegraph.co.uk/chopper, or click on the link in the show notes to this episode.
You quote Nick Kristof there from the New York Times saying we've got hundreds of thousands of people getting their first electricity. We've got 200,000 people getting water for the first time. Does that progress, do you think, annoy the wokerati? They can't bear the fact that actually life is getting better outside of the pandemic.
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? Because my worry about the modern generation is this sort of massive increase in anxiety and what they claim to be depression, other mental illness and so on, has got so out of control that almost every young person thinks they're ill in some way. And in fact, if you looked at the history of planet Earth right to the point of the pandemic, we've never had it so good. On almost every single indicator, you would say it's the best time to ever be alive. There's fewer wars being fought. People are living longer. They're living healthier. There's less poverty, particularly less child poverty, less kids dying young. Every indicator really is positive. Now, the pandemic obviously has created new challenges, but it remains the best time to ever be alive. And I think my message to young people who feel constant anxiety about normal life stuff is, I think they need to be taught at school mental strength and resilience, not encouraged all the time to think there's something wrong with them. You know, it's perfectly normal to feel a bit anxious about life, but are we teaching these kids at school the right way? I chart it back to the end of the egg and spoon race, which was abandoned because it got too competitive. Now everybody has to get a participation prize, even if they come last in a race at school. Why? What are we sending as a message to these kids? You come last in life and you get a prize. How does that help prepare them for normal life stuff where, by the way, you don't get a prize? When I got fired from the Daily Mirror, nobody gave me a prize. I got sent home in dispatches and was ridiculed and mocked for a year. So the real world is not like that. You don't get participation prizes. And I think we've got to be much smarter at school in preparing kids for the real world. And I speak as someone with 4 kids myself.
Is there an age at which you think people stop being woke and become a gammon?
Well, there's an age when you have to be...
Have we passed it yet, Piers? Probably have.
Well, I'm quite glad I've got 4 younger kids, obviously, who do keep me or try and keep me on the straight and narrow about contemporary feelings and what their age group are thinking about stuff, because I think that keeps you younger in mind. I certainly don't want to be the old gammon, as they put it, spewing off about stuff. I like to think I'm reasonably progressive in my views, actually, about most things. I'm not remotely racist or sexist or transphobic or any of those things. Homophobic, certainly not. I've always promoted trans rights, gay rights, equality with women, racial equality. So I'm proud of that and my record on that. But I do think it's easy these days for everyone to add that allegation. And I'll give the example would be Meghan and Harry, where they were rightly, in my view, criticized for their rank hypocrisy over things like preaching to us about the environment and climate change and using Elton John's private plane like a taxi service. And yet when they were criticized, they framed it via friends as racism. But it wasn't racism. If it had been racism, they would have got a terrible coverage up to the point of their wedding. But they didn't. They got total euphoria. They only got criticized when they started being hypocritical.
You said your kids keep you on the straight and narrow in the modern world, but your son has said you're obsessed with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Is that right? Are you obsessed by them?
Well, he made a good point. He was like, Dad, why do you keep going on about them? I went, he said, why do you care so much? I said, I don't. He said, well, why do you keep banging on about them? It's a perfectly reasonable point. I think the problem with Meghan and Harry is they are massive attention seekers. On one level, I admire the work, being one myself. But I think they demand attention. They constantly do stuff deliberately to get attention. And given my job is to comment on what's happening in the news, if they're all over the front pages, it would be perverse of me not to comment on them or write about them. So you're sort of trapped in a weird situation where they profess to want to be left alone. And really, a lot of us would quite like to leave them alone, but then they do the exact opposite of what they claim and constantly grab attention by doing stuff that demands that we then write about them.
The book talked about Black Lives Matter. We've had Trevor Phillips on this podcast before, and he was saying that it's all very well people signalling support for BLM, and that could be a virtue signalling issue for I'm sure you might argue. But I was struck by what Andy Peters told you in the book when you were asking him why do more black people not win awards, and Andy said, look around, I'm the only black person in this room, looking at all of the people backstage at GMB, and that day there were no black people in the crew. What more can you do, Piers Morgan, to advance black causes? Why can't you insist that, say, 20% of the people working with you at GMB are black? That might help more than a million tweets.
Well, I think actually the most powerful thing I could do was make a big point of talking about that very thing on air. And I've done it regularly since. I regularly said that what Andy Peters did that day was incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And it has seen real change at ITV. You see it every day with the people that are now given airtime compared to what was going on before. I don't think it was deliberate before. I think it's just the way TV was. It's been a very white industry for a very long time. But fortunately, I think the events of this year have shaken people, particularly the George Floyd killing, into making people more aware that to affect change, you can't just virtue signal. You can't just do your black square on Instagram and think that's your job done.
Yeah.
And I think by having that conversation with Andy Peters, it really concentrated people's minds.
Where does the woke debate leave mainstream parties? Which is the wokest or the most wide awake party, do you think?
Well, I guess the Liberal Democrats would claim they are, but I'm not sure they are. I mean, the Corbynites were certainly in their heads very woke, but they were extraordinarily intolerant of anyone that deviated from the Corbynite view of life. And there'd be a perfect illustration of what I call a wokey. It's not anything to do with being awake to social and racial injustice. It's about cancelling anyone and anything that doesn't agree with you. So there's a good illustration.
Lawrence Fox, a new party being launched called Reclaim. Is that required, do you think? Will you join it?
Well, I think he makes some quite good points, Lawrence. He slightly overdoes it sometimes, but I think he makes a point about freedom of speech. And of course, he came to fame on Question Time when he was talking about Meghan Markle and how it doesn't all have to be framed as racism. He was right. I supported him on that. I think I watch what he does. I agree with some of it. I don't agree with some of it, but I think he's perfectly entitled to do it. And the way he got treated by his own actors' union, Equity, was appalling. Yeah. And that's where I protect his right to speak his mind.
I think Equity did walk back from that cancellation, in quotes. I know that the PM has been boycotting Good Morning Britain, which is much to your professional frustration. Do you think it might have been better off swapping the last two prime ministers if Boris Johnson had got us out of the European Union than Theresa May would have been better suited to tackling COVID?
Well, I thought Theresa May was pretty hopeless, I have to be honest with you. I think the best person for COVID would have probably been somebody like Gordon Brown, or Brown and Tony Blair, actually, where I felt that they'd had all the experience of swine flu and other stuff like that. They knew the lessons to be learned. It's staggering to me this government hasn't even bothered asking either Blair or Brown for lessons they learned or what they would have done. One of the key ones was going to be, if they had been asked, to bring in the military much earlier, as they're now eventually doing, which I think is what you need with logistics on a crisis of this scale. But no, I don't think Theresa May was a good leader. I think Boris has been found out, sadly, as a bit of a populist buffoon. He seems to have made U-turn after U-turn. The messaging has been horrendous. We ended up with the worst death toll in Europe and the worst economic record in Europe this year, which is scandalous for a country which was the sixth biggest economy in the world. So I think Boris and his cabinet, I'm afraid, failed this country when it really mattered. I think populist leaders, if you look at Brazil or America or Turkey or the UK, they're fine when things are going well. I mean, not fine, but their leadership style can barrage through with bluster and fake news and promises that don't get delivered and so on when things are relatively stable. But the moment you're confronted with a major crisis, then you turn to people like Angela Merkel, who may be very dull in many ways, but hugely experienced, a former physicist, and really took it seriously from the very start, or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, or the leader of South Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam, where they had experience, certainly in these Asian countries, of SARS and earlier epidemics, where they got on top of it and then created whole systems to deal with the potential pandemic.
In your book, you say you're a liberal and a feminist, but you're also mates with Donald Trump. Is that why people can't replace you in the right box?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been friendly with Trump for 15 years. I've written about 120 columns. I think on Trump, half of them have been critical, half have been positive. I just write about him and say if I agree or disagree. That used to be what journalists did. They were fair-minded. But now, because of the tribalism, you're not allowed to. You have to be either completely in the tank for Trump or completely obsessively anti-Trump. I prefer to be somewhere in the middle. On Brexit, I was a Remainer who wanted the result to be delivered. That puts me again in the middle. So both tribes hate me equally. So although people think I'm kind of some weird extremist maverick, on almost every issue, I'm actually somewhere in the middle. I'm what used to be quite popular, the centre ground, but it's become now almost impossible to maintain it. And this has got very thick skin because the tribes on either side demand you get sucked to them.
You're like one of those cowboys with 2 feet on both horses as they divide, aren't you?
Exactly.
Can I pose a question my 15-year-old daughter asked me at the weekend, which I put on Twitter, and it caused a, in quotes, Twitter storm with people saying I made it up, which I didn't. She said to me, what's the difference between Remainers asking for a second referendum on Brexit and Donald Trump demanding a recount?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think Remainers who've been screaming that Trump has to honour the democratic will of the people and leave, well, they spent 4 years trying to overthrow the democratic will of the people. Also, of course, they were all the ones who, when Hillary Clinton lost last time, were screaming that the election was a fix. The Russians had fixed it with Trump. Therefore, it didn't count and it should be ignored. And she won the popular vote. I'm sorry, but that's total hypocrisy. Absolute hypocrisy. I felt last time that Trump should be president. He won it fairly and democratically. There was no evidence in the end of any Russian collusion with Trump or his campaign team that bore any merit. And I feel this time that he's lost and he should go. That to me is a far more consistent and accurate position than those who want to say, yeah, Brexit referendum went the wrong way, so therefore we can't have it. Hillary Clinton lost, can't have that. But Trump, he's got to go.
Well, what's the answer? You say at the end, in a rather depressing conclusion, I thought, we've become a timid, mute, fearful society in which we all walk on eggshells. What's the cure for this?
My clarion call was predominantly not aimed at the right, who I think have their own multiple problems in the way they conduct themselves on the extreme fringes of the right, but it was aimed at my fellow liberals to say, look, it's a friendly fire. I'm one of you. We basically agree about most things, but you've got to stop cancelling everybody and everything that you don't agree with.
And just last one from me. Well, what's your advice to Telegraph readers, listeners to this podcast, about navigating this woke world, which they might find quite scary?
Stand up, resist, don't bow to it. A lot of your listeners will be in positions of power who may be susceptible to pressure from the wokies on social media to cancel employees or, to virtue signal in some grotesque manner just to please them. Don't do it. Don't do it. Run your company with integrity. Run your company with your own values. Make sure they're good values. And don't bow to the mob. The more we don't bow to the mob, the less effective the mob will be.
On that note, Piers Morgan, we've got some questions here from listeners on Twitter. I wonder if I can run through them quickly with you.
Sure.
Margaret Newsom asks on Twitter, if Donald Trump offered you a key role on the new Trump TV channel, would you take it? Would you work for Donald Trump?
I don't think I'd work for Donald Trump. No, he's not my politics. I'm not right-wing, so I wouldn't want to be on a right-wing TV network. But I'm quite happy to occasionally appear on Fox News, as I'm happy to appear on CNN or MSNBC or the BBC here. And to me, I like speaking to as many disparate voices as possible.
And you can add Chopper's politics to that list too now, Piers Morgan.
Exactly. But my personal politics wouldn't want me to be a permanent anchor on something that's too right-wing.
Will Ivanka Trump run for president? Larry Evans asks.
Well, Ivanka Trump or Donald Trump Jr., I think both of them might be itching to get at the presidency, or Donald Trump himself might run again in 2024. He's got this huge mandate from this election. 7 million more people voted for him the last time. More Muslims voted for him. More Black Americans, more Latinos, Hispanics, more LGBTQ people. They all came out and voted in bigger numbers. So after all the hollering about what a racist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic monster he was, a lot of the people that were supposedly the victim of that rhetoric came out and voted for him, which was extraordinary. So he has a big, powerful platform. He's not going to go anywhere.
Benjamin Jackson asks, will Donald Trump attend Joe Biden's inauguration ceremony in January?
Well, I hope he will. I think what's going on now is a bit pathetic and sad, honestly. I think what may be behind it is this situation in Georgia where both their Senate places are up for grabs, one Republican, one Democrat. And I think that Trump's been told by the Republican hierarchy, keep riling up the base for the next few weeks because we need people to vote Republican in Georgia to get control of the Senate. And I think that's what may be behind it. But it looks like the ultimate bad loser.
Yeah.
And it's damaging to America's reputation for democracy, ferocious democracy. But when you win, you win. When you lose, and the loser concedes. And I hope he concedes sooner rather than later. I wrote him an open letter on dailymail.com begging him to concede and do the right thing. I don't think he's going to. But I hope he does. And I hope when the Georgia reruns are done in early January that Trump turns up at the inauguration and wishes Biden all the best in the world for success for America and fellow Americans.
Have you spoken to him since the result was declared?
I haven't. I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago. He rang me about a half-hour chat, Trump and me. It was very interesting. He was very bullish then. He thought he was going to win. I think part of his angst now is he genuinely thought he was going to pull off another shock. And he nearly did. I mean, let's be brutally honest. Putting the popular vote to one side, Biden will end up winning by quite a very small margin in the same swing states that Trump won last time. It's only a few tens of thousands in some or under that in others. And, you're talking about a country of 320 million people coming down to a few thousand votes. So that's why he's so angry. He felt like he very nearly pulled it off.
Away from the election, Bernie asks, why don't you admit to being right-wing, Piers Morgan?
Because I'm not right-wing.
Aren't you virtue signalling by pretending to be left-wing or liberal? Aren't you a fake lefty? I think is Bernie's question.
No, I'm a voice of common sense. I'm very centrist. I don't hate the right and I don't hate the left.
Okay.
But I don't categorize myself as either. I'm basically a journalist. All journalists ought to be fairly central, really. I'd rather just be a journalist.
Yeah, 3 cheers for that. Ian Fletcher asks, what's your least controversial opinion, Piers Morgan?
My least controversial opinion, that ambrosia cream rice is one of the most underrated foodstuffs in the world.
Graham asks, why won't you wind your neck in and go back doing great interviews with celebrities?
I do. I've just finished a whole new series of life stories. Depends what you think my core job is. I think it's multifaceted. I do Good Morning Britain. I write 3 columns a week for the Mail. I do crime documentaries in US prisons with psychopaths and mass murderers. And I also do celebrity interviews. So I like doing all of them.
And just final question from Isla, Piers Morgan. How would you cope if you were cancelled?
I don't think I'll ever be cancelled. I mean, apart from anything else, I have 7.6 million followers on Twitter. Yeah. Now, to put it in context, when I left the Daily Mirror in rather ignominious circumstances in 2004, we were selling 2.5 million copies a day. So I now have a platform 3 times the size of the one that I vacated 15 years ago. And the Mirror now sells a lot less than 2.5 million. So I think when you've developed that kind of social media presence, very hard to be cancelled. You can all try, but you will ultimately fail.
Piers Morgan, thank you for talking to Choppers Politics. And the book, Wake Up by Piers Morgan, is available in all good bookstops from HarperCollins, price £20.
All good bookshops online at the moment, because of course they're not open.
Buy it safely, Piers Morgan, thank you.
All the best.
Well, that's it for this week. What an interesting chat with Piers Morgan there. I hope you enjoyed it, like I did. Love him or loathe him, I thought Piers offered a well-argued critique of the wokerati. I'm not sure, though, he came up with a good solution to the current culture wars. It might be the straightforward answer is this. Turn off Twitter, put your phone down, and go and read a good book. Stranger things have happened. So there we go. Thank you, of course, to Piers Morgan for being our guest this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Theo Ludis, and Elliot Lampitt. And, of course, thank you to you for listening. If you want to go one step further in supporting our journalism, please take out a subscription. You'll pay nothing for 30 days if you go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. You'll get your first month free, and after that, you pay just £2 a week. Great value. As ever, if you enjoyed this episode, or any episode of Choppers Politics for that matter, please do leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Someone who did that this week was called O1I0N. What a mouthful. They said, I really appreciate the depth and width of guests because it promotes a really good quality discussion. Well, if you agree with O1I0N, please do leave us a review yourself. It really helps other people find our podcast when they're searching for the best ones to listen to. If you want to keep in touch, please do email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. And finally, as ever, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, cheerio!